Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2023 week 31. That's July 31st to August 6th. So we are getting closer-ish to current date, only a few weeks behind at this point. And we're going to start off this video with a mail call from Performance World. So I'm getting some PTFE fittings for the clutch cable, as well as I got a I think it's a 1/4" NPT to -6 fitting for the back of the intake, and that's going to go over to my brake booster. So the first thing that we need to do in order to get that -6 fitting on is we need to go over to the map sensor and knock the corner of it off of it. And that's because Holly has set these holes kind of terribly close together, and so you can't really fit a ton of stuff in the back there conveniently. And that is a Holly Sniper EFI 2.5 bar map sensor for the GM style map. What I may end up doing is switching the type of map sensor from that GM style that kind of has like a little O-ring and pushes on. I might just switch that over to a different style, one that's going to be I think it's like a 1/8" NPT, but that might happen a lot later on. For now, we're just going to modify this one, make it work and run with it. So I'm putting tape over top of the sensor because I don't want any of the plastic that I've ground down off of the sensor to end up in it. So just throw a little bit of tape over there, just be a little cautious, and then this kind of works. So one thing about this is that NPT to AN fitting has to be clocked a very specific way, otherwise the map sensor will bump into it. And I did some work off camera because I don't see any Teflon tape on that fitting, but there definitely is now, and there definitely is in the car. And I forgot to turn the camera on, but I put a nice good thick bead of RTV sealant on the front of the engine block and on the back. And I've just got a mirror out now so I can check to make sure that the intake is actually sitting on that bead of RTV and kind of squishing a little bit. And that just kind of tells me that I have enough on it. So what I'm doing now is, since I've got the intake sitting on there, I'm going to go grab all the hardware and we are going to start tightening this intake down. So on the passenger side, what I'm doing on that one stud is I'm double nutting it because the stud was actually sticking up quite a bit out of the intake. So I knew that I hadn't bottomed it out. So I'm just kind of double nutting it, and then I can tighten the top nut to get that stud all the way down. And then with the 2 wrenches, I can break the top nut off. And yeah, that just makes sure that the stud's all the way down in the intake, or in the heads. And so what I'm doing here is I'm looking up the instructions for the high ram intake, and it gives me the bolt pattern and how the sequence for tightening it down. The sequence is important, so make sure you follow it. In the instructions, it clearly states to make sure you have a dab of engine oil on the threads. So that's why I'm taking a little bit of engine oil in an eyedropper and just putting oil directly on the threads. So I did kind of screw this bit up. All I did was I read the final torque spec, but if I recall correctly, I was actually supposed to tighten it down in 2 or 3 equal steps, so I kind of fucked that up. But what I did is I tightened it all down, and then I went back and just made sure in the same order they were all tight. It looks like a lie. It looks like I don't actually go over it a second time. Yeah, but I probably should have. So that's something that, looking back, I'm going to have to go and double check and make sure that the intake is in fact torqued down correctly, and all of them are. Next up, we are going to set up the oil pressure sender. So on these small block Ford blocks, they have this little oil pressure extension. So I'm just cleaning off all of the old Teflon tape. I think it's Teflon tape. Sure, we'll go with Teflon tape. And blow some air through it, just get all of the old oil out of it. If there's any like dust or metal shavings from all the metal work I've been doing, get that all out of there. Put the new Teflon tape on. We'll go back to the block. We'll start threading it in. This is such a lovely camera angle. I hope you guys are really enjoying this because you can't see fuck all that I am doing. Sorry about that, but I'm just tightening this in with a whatever size wrench it is. You didn't really miss anything in that regard, but what I do need to do is I need to clock that little extension to make sure that the fuel pressure sensor can clear the engine plates, and everything else is going to go in there. Now, I don't remember if I brought that fuel pressure sensor down, or the oil pressure sensor, sorry, but in any case, the little extension there has a quarter inch NPT fitting, and I need an 1/8 inch NPT fitting for the Holley sensors. So at this point in time, I don't have the adapter, so I can't install the oil pressure sensor yet anyways, but I can move over and do the fuel pressure sensor. And so I just put the Teflon tape on it, and I'm just kind of getting the fuel pressure take off fitting clocked correctly in where I need it, and then I'll put the sensor in. So now I'm just playing with the harness. I need to get the coolant temperature / pressure sensor wired back up to the harness, but I need to put an end on if I recall correctly. So kind of just messing around with the harness. And I dropped the Teflon tape down into the intake runner. Having the plenum off of the intake while I'm working and having stuff just sitting on top of the intake, it's a real dangerous move. I generally did my best not to put anything on there that was small enough to really fall down into the intake or the exhaust runners. I didn't want to have to take the intake off, and if something had fallen down into one of the runners where the valve was open, because some of the valves are open right now, and it fell on top of the piston, well, that would be catastrophic if I fired it up with anything down on top of the piston. So having the plenum off the top, really risky. I don't really recommend it. And yeah, so while I was talking, put some Teflon tape on the fitting for the 3/8 NPT to 1/4 inch NPT adapter for the coolant temperature and pressure sensor. And then we installed the coolant temperature and pressure sensor. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to install the distributor. Now, this is a Holley dual sync distributor, and it needs when you're setting it up, it wants a 50-degree before top dead center reference angle. So there are timing marks on the balancer. I've got 0, 10, 20, 30. So what I did is I took my calipers between 0 and 20, and then I put the caliper on 30, and wherever the other side landed, that's 50. The other method you can do is you can measure the circumference of your balancer. You can put tape on it, and then there's a calculation you can do that would say 4.5 inches from 0 degrees would be your 50-degree mark. Now, I didn't do it that way. I just did it the way I wanted to do it because it was quicker and easier, quite frankly. But when I did that, I turned the balancer, and so now I am trying to find top dead center again. Top dead center on the intake stroke. So what I was trying to do is put my finger over the spark plug hole and just try and plug it, because in theory, once the piston comes up, it should compress and, put some pressure on your finger, but I wasn't able to get a great seal. So instead, I went an alternate method. I just took my flashlight, looked down the intake runner, and as soon as I saw the intake valve opening, well, I knew we were on the compression stroke, and then I could set the balancer at the 50-degree mark that I set. So now what I'm doing is I am just confirming that on the dual sync distributor, there's a little notch in it. And so I am just confirming that little notch is actually, what typically would have been where the rotor would be pointing. And it was correct. So what I'm doing right now is I threw a little bit of paper towel down in the distributor hole just so that I can clean up the silicone around the intake, just to make it a little bit nicer. The distributor comes with this installation oil. So technically, since I'm planning on firing this up fairly quickly, I probably could have used engine oil, but I didn't have engine oil at the time. I did have the lubrication that they provided and that it came with, so I used it. At this point in time, I know I need to, once I get the ECU powered up, I know I need to set the ignition at that time, but for right now I'm just dropping this in there any which way. I have not set the timing on this yet, so don't think this is how you install a dual sync distributor. I will go through installing it, and a ways down the road I will probably do an instructional video on how to set it, but I'm not doing that right this second. All right, so now that the distributor is in, now I'm going to repin the coolant temperature and pressure sensor combo. That's got a DTM 6 pin on it. I only need 4 pins, so I'm going to depin that and replace that 6 with a 4. It's just a little bit more compact, and that way, you know, I'm not wasting a 6 pin when I don't need to. So as I depin this, what ended up happening is 2 of the wires actually broke, and the sockets actually broke off of the wires. Now, this is probably my fault, because when I initially pinned this connector, I did not cut the ends, and the ends had come pre-soldered from Holley. So I think what had happened is that solder weakened the wire, or at least it wasn't as good as just the crimp on wire itself. So when I crimped ends over the factory soldered end, it just became very brittle and it broke. So I'm actually kind of happy that it broke now, and not, you know, while I'm going down the road and all of a sudden I got no coolant temperature, or, you know, something else wacky happens. So I just cut all the ends off, restrip them, and I put 4 new sockets back on the pressure transducer and coolant combo. So I'm just going through and reading the instructions to figure out which colors on the connector or on the sensor are for which, because I'm going to need a +5 sensor reference, I'm going to need a sensor ground, and then I need a pressure transducer signal and a coolant temperature signal. So I just want to make sure I know what color wire is doing what. With the coolant temperature all hooked up, we're going to pull the fuel rail feeds out, and then we are going to start plugging injectors in. So obviously you can't see much because I'm working on the other side, but you will get to see me just pull some wires through the intake and hook up the injectors on this side when I get there. I'm going to hook up now is the boost reference line for the fuel pressure regulator. So that is a 1/16 NPT to a 1/8 NPT fitting, and I'm going to use regular like truck airline, 1/4 inch truck airline, if I recall correctly, to go from the intake into the fuel pressure regulator, and then as well from the intake over to the surge valve for the Pro Charger. I don't have that set up yet, but that'll be coming before I fire up the engine. That hose isn't super flexible. Ideally, I would have a, another or an NPT fitting coming out of the top of this, and then I could have like a right angle connector so that that doesn't have that huge loop up. But I can always change that later on down the line. I just want to get the car running at this point in time. It's better to have it running right now than to have it perfect, because I can always go back and make some tweaks and some changes once everything's running, once everything's, shaken out. Alright, so next up, it looks like we are grabbing some gaskets for a water pump. So let's get that water pump on there, make sure we get the gasket the right way. We do just temporarily hold it there, and we're going to start firing all of the accessories back onto this car right quick. So this thing is filthy right now, so just using some paper towel to give it a bit of a clean up, get all the dust and dirt and crap off of it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pull out all of the accessories from the car and just kind of throw them out under the engine at the front, so that way I can just start putting everything back together. You kind of seen me put all of these pieces together individually, so now I'm just going to go back and put them all right back together. I don't think I'm probably going to say too much more because you've already seen most of this in previous videos. The only difference now is I'm actually using gaskets and torquing stuff down and making sure that everything is fitting properly. So right here, the issue I'm running into is the bottom bolt is too long. So because it's too long, obviously it's not going to tighten up against the spacer, and then the bracket's not going to hold anything all that well. So what I'm going to need to do is either find a shorter bolt or shorten this bolt. And since I didn't have any shorter bolts, I'm going to shorten this one. So this is one of those moments where I forgot that I need to put the Pro Charger bracket on before I put the idler on. So all that work I just did getting this idler on, we're going to pull it back off in order to get the Pro Charger bracket on. So now I am actually putting this Pro Charger belt on for realsies this time. The last time I was working on this, I didn't really put the belt on, but this time I'm putting it on with the intention of having the car fired up at some point in time in the month of August. So I really got to figure out this tensioner and, you know, try and get the belt on. And I had a lot of struggle with this. I am not going to lie. It was a huge pain in the ass. Because of that Mazira water pump, it extends out quite a distance, and I'm pretty sure the idler would have liked to have come up quite a bit more. And we're gonna I gotta see once I get this running if it's gonna even work, because there's only about 1/8 of an inch, maybe 1/4 of an inch clearance between the pulley and the water pump when I actually get the belt on and the tensioner tightened. And you know, as you can see, I'm trying to get this belt on, and it is just fighting me. It is fighting me every step of the way. I'm putting a ton of force on it. That the entire Pro Charger bracket, which right now isn't even fully tight, is bending. So yeah, so what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get the pulley on to the tensioner with the belt below, but in the process I kind of bunged up the threads. So I'm going to take my, you know, I'm going to keep trying this, but eventually I'm going to take my tap, clean up the threads, because yeah, I screwed it up, and you know, it's just real tough to get it on there. Throughout this entire process, I was swearing a lot. I was real pissed off. I was very frustrated. You know, it shouldn't be this hard, but here we are. And so yeah, that was my experience with this. It was a lot of frustration. And as you can see, after a lot, and I mean a lot of working on this, I finally get the bolt started to a point where I don't think it's cross-threading, and I'm happy with it, and we get that on. So now I can try and set tension on the belt and get the tensioner away from the water pump. And now I'm going to tighten down the Pro Charger bracket just to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. I should have probably done this sooner, but it's done now. What I'm going to do is I'm just taking a straight edge. I'm kind of checking the alignment of the crank pulley to the Pro Charger pulley. And they're not perfectly straight, which is quite surprising to me. I don't know why there would be a bit of a difference, but it looks like they're kind of pulled inwards to one another. So the right side of the crank pulley is pulled towards the block, and the left side of the Pro Charger pulley is also pulled towards the block. So we're gonna have to see what happens when we get this fired up, if it throws a belt or if it stays on, and I'll kind of have to figure it out from there. Maybe it's acceptable and it's within tolerance, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the tension off. I'm going to loosen some things and just see if I can get that alignment a little bit better. Another thing that's happening is the belt is currently touching the tensioner. So what I'm going to do is make sure pulley bolts are tight, and then I'm just going to spin the engine just to kind of get the belt aligned on the pulleys. And then it does pull away from that tensioner, and I've got about a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 of an inch spacing. So that's probably going to be good enough. And with that belt on, it is time to clean up the shop a little bit. With the shop a little bit cleaner, we are just going to move on to continuing to reinstall things on the engine. Now that my wiring harness is more or less where it needs to be, I can, connect the alternator output wire. But what I'm finding is there's a little plastic shroud around the alternator output, probably to protect it from, coming into contact with the case and stuff like that. So what I need to do is I just need to modify the little plastic bit to get my 4-gauge lug on there. And for that, I'm just taking a little file. I'm just going to file down the plastic. Once I file down the plastic and that lug fits on there correctly, I will cut and make the end for the alternator. So we're going to move on to doing some of the wiring for the starter and getting the wire for the coils up to the head. And so that's what I'm going to do. I got to cut it back 'cause I'm rerouting the starter and alternator wires. Originally the plan was to have it go through the cross member up and around the header, but that's just not a lot of clearance. So for the starter, I'm going to come along the K-member and then just straight into the starter around the headers, and then the alternator wire will still go up and around. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some ends on these two ground wires. So one of those is the ground for the water pump and one of those is the ground for the air conditioning compressor. And then this is the wire from the coils that go to the back of the head. So I'm going to run that up with the alternator wire, and then we're going to attach to the back of the head. And now for a little bit of everybody's favorite cleanup time. So now we're gonna start getting ready to, try and fire the car. So one of the things I gotta do is get the dash back in. But I remember from the last time I had the dash in that I had not cut these provisions for the cage well enough, so it's a real bitch getting it in and out. So I'm just opening up those holes a little bit to make it easier to slide in and out. And then on the back side, what am I gonna do here? I don't even remember. Oh, I'm looking at the vents, because what I need to do is I need to build some 3D printed parts to adapt the vents to my classic auto air unit. So I'm just taking a few of those measurements, and then I'll go and design them off camera and 3D print them off camera and do all that fun stuff. But I need the measurements before I can do any of that. All right, time to get this dash back in. I'm just going to rehook all the wires. That's the ground, dash illumination, and dash power. So right now I don't really care too much about which gauges plug into where, especially considering I didn't label them when I took them all off. I know that I'm going to have to redo some of this wiring. I think what I'm probably going to end up doing is cutting the wires that go from the gauges to the back panel a lot shorter. And when I do that, I'll make sure I label everything. And the reason why I want to cut all those wires a lot shorter is, there's about, what, 1.5 feet, 2 feet, maybe even 2.5, 3 feet of wire there. And getting all of that stuffed in behind the dash is just not really feasible. So I'll have to redo that, and that's okay. So when I took this dash out the first time, there is a wire here that comes from the dash gauge module, and I just cut it so I could get it out, but now I need to make it so that it's in there permanently, so I'm going to put a Deutsch connector on there. So yeah, with all that wire in there, the dash doesn't really sit all that nicely. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a little bit of masking tape and just make it so that the gauge cluster doesn't fall out. This is totally ghetto, but I don't care. I just want it to stick up there while I'm doing some work. Alright, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the ignition switch in this car. And the reason why I'm going to replace it is the ignition switches on these cars are known for going bad. So when I ordered some stuff from Late Model Restoration, I just threw a new ignition switch in there as well. I also ordered one of these new ignition switch slider things that when you turn the key, it moves to activate the switch. But I found out that in order for me to switch that piece, I would probably have to take a lot of the column apart, and I just didn't feel like doing that. So all I do is end up putting a new ignition switch on this. So with the new ignition switch on there, I'm going to throw the steering column in the car and just kind of get it up into place. Now that I have the steering column in place, I'm just going to do some spot checks on the wiring before I, plug the battery in and plug the ignition switch in fully. And the reason why I'm doing that is I just kind of want to make sure that that everything's the way I think it's supposed to be, and it ends up everything is the way I think it's supposed to be. So with that, I'm going to remount the ECU in the car. So we're gonna reconnect the battery now. ECU's back in the car, so that's a good thing. And now I'm just, checking power, checking to see that I have the power at the solenoids that I expect to, and I don't. I got 12 volts at the battery, but I think I've only got, or no, sorry, my battery is low, isn't it? I think it showed like 7 volts or something like that. So voltage is low, so I'm going to throw the battery charger on it. I think it's only at like, what, 50%, something like that? Yeah, 43%, yeah, so it was low, so we'll charge the battery. While that's happening, I can go and do some more work on some wiring. I think that's what I'm going to do. Or it looks like I'm dropping the column for some reason. Yeah, I'm dropping the column so that I can get at the ground stud behind there, because there's a ground wire that I never connected, which is for the emergency shutoff switch that I'm going to have above my head. So I just want to get the ground onto this stud so that I can just, twist it together up top and activate the contactors in the back. So what I'm doing right now is, you can kind of see, but there was 2 black wires up there. I just tied them together, and that's the ground for the contactors. So when I turn the key on, I'm expecting to get power in certain places now, and it just wasn't really doing what I would expect. It wasn't really working. The contactors aren't engaging. I'm not getting the power I expect, so I'm thinking, oh, maybe the ground here is wrong. I'm fiddling with the ground and it's not really working. So I go to the back of the car and I just start checking power, and I realize that the main fuse is loose. When this fuse holder came, it never came with nuts to secure it, so it's loose. And that's probably the big problem why nothing's working as I expected. So I try to just kind of secure it in place with those clips, but that's a bad idea. So I end up, I just need to end up going to the store to buy some new nuts. And so you didn't really notice, but that was a transition there. I stopped the recording, ripped out to the store, got some nuts, and now I'm putting those on and getting this actually tightened down properly. So now that fuse is tightened down properly, I'm going to just check some power, and I'm not getting the power I expect. I got 12 volts on the battery, but I'm only getting like 10 volts at the contactors. So what that tells me is the battery terminals are very dirty because it's not transferring the full amount of electricity from the post into the terminal over to the contactors. So I pull the battery terminal off. I've got a little battery terminal cleaner, so I get it on there and I just clean the terminal and get it nice and shiny and, you know, make it good again. And with that, I got 12 volts at the battery, I got 12 volts at the contactors. I am a happy camper. So you just saw there, I turned the ignition on, all the gauges swiveled. The steering wheel is just completely free because it's not attached to anything. That's okay, that's fine. But yeah, so I've got ignition, that's all working. You know, gauges are flipping around, they're moving, they're doing nice things. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to hook into the ECU with my laptop. So the first thing I do when I plug it in, nothing works as I expect. It doesn't connect. I got key on. It doesn't link. So I got to start doing some troubleshooting on this, and yeah, this is kind of odd, but I mean, it's my first foray into this, so I don't know what to expect. So what I'm doing is I'm checking for power at specific places. So I'm checking for power, the main power wire. Do I have 12 volts there? Yes, I do. And then I check, I think it's J1A10, which is the switch 12 volt input. Do I have power there? Yes, I do. So as far as I can tell, everything on the ECU power-wise should be good. This should be communicating. So I just do some troubleshooting on the computer. Is it recognizing the new USB device, etc., etc. When I unplug the ECU and plug it in, do I hear the bang from Windows? Yes, I do. I just do a whole pile of troubleshooting. I go onto the Holly forums. One of the things is, one of the guys says is, you know, reinstall the Holly software. This is Windows 11, so they say it's compatible, so everything should be working. I do. I end up reinstalling the Holly software. so everything reinstalls. I'm gonna reboot and see if this fixes it. So yeah, so I've got my global file open and I'm not seeing any action thus far. And so I'm not quite sure what's going on. Now when I plug in, it's telling me that the firmware is out of date and I need to flash the firmware. I'm not sure how to do that. So I quickly pull up a course that I've subscribed to. It's called Tune the Trilogy, and Joe Simpson explains how to update the firmware. So I'm just gonna go to his site, find where it is, find his episode on updating the software or doing the firmware update, watch it, and then yeah, you'll see, oh, that's what I got to do. Okay, and then I just go over to the Holly window, click a couple buttons, and it starts updating the firmware because it is connected now. So it looks like reinstalling, the software worked, everything's connected now, it's all good. So yeah, so it takes a while to do the firmware update, and you know, while it's doing the firmware update, my entire thought process is just don't die, don't disconnect, don't break my ECU, please. But yeah, so it took, I don't know, a minute or two, the firmware updated, and then if I recall correctly, everything seems okay. I'm able to transfer my tune into the ECU, etc., etc. So yeah, so here I am transferring my tune into the ECU, and then I'm just looking at the gauges. I noticed that my fuel pressure gauge is like 89, I think it is, which is odd. I shouldn't have any fuel pressure right now. Alright, so now that I have the ECU connected and powered up, I can move over to setting the distributor, the Holy Dual Sync distributor. You need to set the cam and the crank sensor. Right now, in order to set this up, there should be a crank light and a cam light on. I don't think I have either of the lights on. So I'm just trying to figure out how this distributor all installs and how it all works. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling out the distributor and I'm reclocking the wheel so that the number one, or what would be number one cylinder, is kind of pointing towards the magnetic pickup. And then with that, I plug everything back in. And if I recall correctly, I do in fact then have the cam and the crank light on as I would expect. And I'm able to set this up per the specifications. So here I am back on the laptop, just checking a few things out. I plugged the ECU in and nothing, doesn't connect again. I run into the same problem that I ran into before. So I didn't realize at that exact moment in time. No, I did. So I go and I think I reinstall the software. I do a bunch more troubleshooting, and I just have a huge frustrating time trying to get this ECU to reconnect. I even have a spare USB cable. Holly sold me a spare one already comes with the Dominator, so I didn't even need it. But at this point, I was like, oh, fortunately, they sold me an extra cable, even though it wasn't needed. So I'm trying a different cable, and even that doesn't work. So yeah, it sucks that I'm having a horribly terrible time trying to get this ECU connected to Windows 11. Windows 11 is a huge steaming pile of garbage. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. So as always, if you've stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll catch you in the next one.